Good morning. I'm Claude Perron from NPS Pharma. This morning I was not invited actually to talk about NPS Pharma. This story is in full evolution. But I was asked to go back in history and share with you my experience in the HIV/AIDS area back in the 80s and the 90s. And I think more importantly, it's what can be learned from those years when we came up with new options for patients with HIV that can continue to be applied today. So let's go back in history. I won't go through that in details, but again, this is a relatively young condition. AIDS was first reported back in 1981, and actually HIV virus as the cause of AIDS was only confirmed in 1984, so it's only 30 years ago. And the first treatment that made it through the regulatory authorities is AZT, zoldavidine, which was first approved in 1987. And then obviously the benefits of AZT found in the maternal fetal transmission of HIV and the data presented back in 1994 for that. And in the mid-90s, we basically went through the era of recognizing that monotherapy to combat HIV was just not the way to go. And therefore, we would need to attack the virus in multiple angles, and therefore combination therapy was born. And in the mid-90s, we also recognized that these treatments were very complex and were very hard to follow, and therefore fixed combination products also came to market. And then so on, obviously, with new targets identified, the protease inhibitors, the fusion inhibitors, and then the CCR5 agonists, and more recently, the integrase inhibitors. I think the key to that first slide is really at the bottom, where you see that new medicines, obviously including combination therapy, has basically transformed what was a once fatal condition into a chronically managed condition. So the first question that I have for you this morning is, who was awarded the discovery of the HIV virus? So,
that's a controversial question.
Yeah. A, Professor Robert Gallo from the National Cancer Institute in the US. B, Magic Johnson. C, Luc Montagnier. Or D, Luc Montagnier and Robert Gallo as co-discoverers. And you're right. The answer is both actually were finally found co-discoverers. I have to tell you that this saga went for a while because both of these researchers basically worked on identifying HIV as being the cause of AIDS. And it's actually back in 1986 when Ronald Reagan was still US president and François Mitterrand was the French president, that they finally met on this and decided to agree that both researchers should be awarded the co-discovery of HIV. So a bit of history. So going back to the early days, most of the patients before blood tests became available to diagnose HIV, these patients were coming in very, very late in their disease progression, and basically were diagnosed with opportunistic infection. Most of the times were pneumonia, fungal infections, herpes infections, and basically were diagnosed as being AIDS at that point in time. Then there was the identification of surrogate markers, the CD4, obviously, which were the cells targeted by HIV. And then viral load became a surrogate marker where we could monitor disease progression. And I have to go back also at the time that we had to show clinical outcomes in order to show the regulatory authorities that your product was basically effective to treat a condition. And it was again in HIV/AIDS that surrogate markers became components of the drug approval process, and actually now many conditions are approved through surrogate marker data. I'll switch a little bit into patient requests for early access, and again, patient played a major role, and I think that's a key point I want you to keep for today, is that at that time, you know, there was the patient were not part of the equation, and they basically put a lot of pressure on the clinical trial programs, the regulatory authorities to get faster approval of medications, a lot of pressure on the industry to bring new options, and basically moving from SAP programs in Ottawa to compassionate use of the programs. When we launched 3TC in Canada, we had about 3,000 patients on compassionate access before we launched the product. So most of these products made it from labs to patients in record times. I can tell you that 3TC was in the lab back in 1989 and was in patients in 1995, and the protease inhibitors are probably faster than that. So basically, this era was what made today what I call the stakeholder transformation. So historically, industry was dealing only with healthcare professionals. And in the 80s, the payers switched from a more passive into a more active role with the introduction of pharmacoeconomics. But what the HIV area brought was basically the patients into the equation and their influence in making sure that access to new medicine was key, and they were actually the ultimate benefiters of these new options. So people with HIV brought changes in the way the authorities are working and industries operating. Before it was rigid and opaque processes, and now they're more flexible and transparent processes. And you can see that there's a lot of things that were put forward, priority review and OCC with Health Canada, demand for more transparency and accountability throughout the process, more transparency at the HTA level, patient participation in those different reviews. And obviously, not only consulting with physicians now, but having to consult patients when we bring new products to market. So I'll just touch base briefly on incremental innovation because I think that's sometimes taken for granted. But incremental innovation was very key in making sure that those AIDS cocktails actually became easier to take for patients, and therefore were becoming treatments that were easy to adhere to. A lot of these regimens had to be taken with food, without food, before meals, after meals, and I think some of these fixed dose combination basically made some of those treatments easier to take. And actually back in 2006, the first pill that combined a complete, effective, easy to tolerate regimen was brought to market, the Tripla. And it had to be just taken once a day. So in a span of about 10 years, we went from very complex regimens to a once a day full regimen. And then obviously breakthrough innovation. We started with the reverse transcriptase inhibitors and went to protease inhibitors, and then the new targets identified like fusion inhibitors, CCR5s, and more recently integrase inhibitors. So breakthrough innovation continues to be key in managing conditions like viral infections. And obviously we will probably live through that with the Ebola situation that we're living through now. And obviously continue to refine the surrogate markers technology, more sensitive testing, better drug resistance testing as well to continue to manage optimal therapy for patients. So I think that slide says it all. When you look at the mortality rate in the early 90s going to 16 deaths per 100,000 population of HIV patients. When combination therapy was introduced in 1995, you can see the dramatic decrease in the death rate, actually a 67% decrease between 95 and 2000. And then obviously as new products came to market, new targets became available, and new products sibling those targets, the mortality rate continued to decrease significantly. Which means now, as I said at the beginning, that AIDS is a chronically managed condition, which was, as I said 30 years ago, a fatal condition. So, last question. Who was the first celebrity in the 80s that passed away from AIDS? Is it Jimmy Hoffa? Is it Lyle Alzado? Was it Rock Hudson? Or D. Arthur Ashe? Yes, you are right once again. So Rock Hudson, actually the Rockford Files, if you remember that program, Rock Hudson passed away in 1984 and actually was the first celebrity that passed away from HIV. Magic Johnson, as you know, is still alive today. He's been on combination therapy for years and again lives with HIV chronically. And we know that Arthur Ashe passed away in the early 90s from HIV as well. Jimmy Hoffa, well, I don't know where he is. So in summary, because my time is up, I think I had one more slide, but I guess what I wanted to say is that, you know, when you have to face a challenge, you need to bring all stakeholders, and we heard it many times this morning, as many stakeholders as you can have involved in bringing new products to market. the better you'll be. So if you can share your plans with patients ahead of time, with the payers, obviously with the healthcare professionals, you'll be much better off. And I think the HIV experience was a great experience at a time where there was no Facebook, no internet. We were meeting with patients face to face, and we had to share with them what was going on. So again, thank you for your time.